The man who once slipped out of prison through a tunnel carved beneath a shower floor now lives in a place built for men the system believes can never be allowed to vanish again. In July 2019, after a trial that turned his name into a headline across the world, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán stood in federal court in Brooklyn and received the sentence that would define the rest of his life. Life in prison, plus 30 years, and a forfeiture order so massive it read less like punishment and more like a final accounting of an empire. For decades, his world had been movement, safe houses, mountain roads, hidden compartments, border routes, coded phones, men arriving and disappearing in silence. Then, in a single day, all of that motion ended. The future narrowed to steel, concrete, controlled light, in the kind of confinement designed specifically for someone whose past had embarrassed entire governments. From that point on, the story changed its shape. It was no longer the story of a cartel leader expanding territory, escaping raids, or rebuilding power after capture. It became the story of what remains when escape is treated as the central threat. Guzmán had already done what few inmates in modern history had done twice. He had broken out of prison in Mexico, once in 2001 and again in 2015, the second escape becoming infamous because it involved a sophisticated tunnel running to a house outside the prison walls. That history followed him into the United States like a shadow attached to every file bearing his name. By the time the sentence was imposed, there was no realistic version of his imprisonment that looked ordinary. The destination expected for a man like that was not a standard federal block. It was Florence, Colorado, ADX, the place that exists for inmates considered too dangerous, too high profile, or too much of a security risk for almost anywhere else in the federal system. ADX Florence is often described in public reporting as one of the most restrictive prisons in America, but that phrase still feels too simple for what it represents. The institution is not famous because it is chaotic, it is famous because it is controlled. Everything about its public image suggests the same purpose: remove unpredictability, reduce contact, eliminate opportunity, and compress daily life into something measured, repeated, and observed. Men there are typically held alone in cells for most of the day. Movement is limited. Time is structured. The architecture itself sends the message long before any routine does. At ADX, confinement is not just a sentence, it is the environment. For someone whose legend was built on slipping through gaps, exploiting corruption, and staying one step ahead of capture, that kind of place carries a brutal irony. The most notorious escape artist in the drug trade had been delivered to a prison made famous for preventing exactly that. And that is where the mythology starts to fall apart. Outside prison walls, the name El Chapo had once suggested reach. Orders could travel farther than he did. Violence could erupt in places he never physically entered. Loyalty and fear could move ahead of him, clearing roads and closing mouths. But inside a supermax, the world shrinks until reputation has nothing to grip. There are no crowds to impress, no mountains to retreat into, no convoy to disappear into at night, no tunnel hidden beneath a tile floor waiting to become history. In nonfiction terms, this is the part of the story that matters most. Incarceration in the United States did not turn him into a larger figure. It made the practical reality of his life smaller, narrower, slower, and increasingly defined by absence. Not absence as a metaphor, absence as routine, absence of movement, absence of private contact, absence of the family life that still mattered to him even after the empire was gone. The public does not see his days unfold hour by hour. There was no full diary from inside, no open window into what he thinks when the lights settle into another controlled cycle. Much of prison life at that level remains deliberately hidden behind policy, process, and the sealed-off silence of a supermax unit. but the outline is visible. Court records, public filings, and official information reveal the broad shape of it. He is not living the final chapter of a kingpin fantasy. He is living the reality of a life sentence in one of the harshest environments the federal system has. The world that once measured his value in routes, shipments, territory, and fear now measures it in permissions, restrictions, and the narrow terms of what is allowed. That contrast is what makes the story so unsettling. The same man whose name once moved across borders now depends on whether any contact across a single prison line is approved. Years passed like that. The headlines faded, but the confinement did not. His sentence did not change. The concrete did not care whether his name was famous. And then, in 2024, the stillness cracked. Not with an escape, not with a dramatic new conspiracy, but with something quieter and more revealing. A letter surfaced in the public record. In it, Guzmán complained that he had been unable to get regular calls or visits with his family, including his daughters. It was the kind of complaint that sounds almost ordinary until his name is attached to it, and then it becomes something stranger. One of the most feared traffickers of his era, reduced to writing about missed contact, unanswered requests, and the distance between himself and the children he could not reach. The judge's answer was cold, procedural, and final in tone. Prison conditions, after conviction, were the responsibility of the Bureau of Prisons, not the court. The empire was gone, the trial was over, and now even his plea for family contact seemed to disappear into another wall he could not move. That was the real twist of life behind bars. It was not just that he had lost power, it was that the story had become painfully small. Not small in consequence, but small in scale. A man once associated with billions of dollars, international smuggling routes, and spectacular prison breaks, now was making headlines because he said he couldn't hear his daughters' voices. The contrast was almost unbearable in its simplicity. This was no longer the drama of pursuit, it was the long punishment of endurance. And when that letter entered the record, it revealed something the public rarely gets to see in stories like this. Not the myth of El Chapo, but the cage around the man who was left after the myth had been locked away. And that was only the beginning. By the second phase of his sentence, the shock had worn off for the outside world. The headlines had moved on. New trials replaced old ones. New crimes climbed into public attention. But inside a supermax prison, time does not move with the rhythm of headlines. It moves in repetition. It moves in controlled routines, in the same walls holding the same silence, in the slow pressure of days that begin to resemble one another so completely that even memory starts to flatten. For Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, this was the part no courtroom could fully describe. Sentencing had been dramatic, transfer had been symbolic, but what came after was not dramatic at all. It was the long, colorless stretch that turned punishment into a permanent landscape. The legend that once surrounded him had been built on noise. There had been wealth, movement, coded messages, guarded compounds, frantic escapes, whispered deals, and the constant threat that somewhere someone would betray him or die because of him. His former life was unstable, dangerous, and violent, but it was never still. Stillness was the one thing it did not allow. In prison, stillness became the central fact. The pace was no longer dictated by opportunity, fear, or power. It was dictated by the limits of confinement. The man who had once measured risk by the reach of entire governments was now forced into a reality defined by walls, schedule, and the absence of control over even the smallest parts of his day. That is what makes his life behind bars so unsettling to imagine. It is not simply the loss of freedom, it is the collapse of scale. Every empire, no matter how vast, becomes meaningless when reduced to a locked room and a life sentence. Every myth eventually runs into a hard surface. In Guzmán's case, that hard surface was not only concrete and steel, but routine itself. Routine is what breaks the illusion that a notorious man remains larger than the system holding him. No matter what his name once meant in Sinaloa, Chicago, Brooklyn, or the mountain regions where he built his legend, prison reduced that name to an inmate identity inside a federal institution designed to erase unpredictability. And yet, even in that reduction, the past never completely disappeared. It remained present in the reason his confinement was so severe. He was not just another inmate serving time for a federal conviction. He was the man whose history had forced governments into humiliation. He was the man whose escape through a tunnel had become one of the most infamous prison stories in the modern world. That history meant that every restriction around him was shaped by what he had already proven capable of. He entered prison carrying not only his sentence, but the memory of 2 escapes that guaranteed he would never again be treated as a man who could be managed casually. There is a strange cruelty in that kind of imprisonment. It does not require chaos, it does not require visible violence, it works by removing almost everything that once gave life its shape. In public imagination, people often think of punishment as an event. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, the dramatic last look in a courtroom. But the real punishment begins after the spectacle ends. It begins when the cameras are gone, when there is no audience left, when the story no longer belongs to the public and instead belongs to the clock. That was the world Guzmán entered after 2019, a world where the punishment was not sudden but constant. Over time, the contrast between the man he had been and the conditions he lived in became the most revealing part of the story. This was once one of the most powerful traffickers on Earth, a man accused of overseeing routes that carried narcotics across continents, a figure whose influence reached through money, fear, and loyalty into places most people would never see. But inside prison, those qualities did not translate. Power built in the outside world had almost no use inside a system designed to strip influence down to the barest possible level. Wealth could not purchase release, reputation could not open doors, fear could not widen the cell. The very qualities that had once made him dangerous now became reasons for the system to close even tighter around him. Then came the reminder that prison does not punish only by confinement, it also punishes through distance. In 2024, the public got a rare glimpse into that reality when Guzmán complained through a filing that he had not been able to maintain regular calls or visits with his family, including his daughters. It was a small detail in legal terms, but emotionally it changed the shape of the story. Suddenly, the figure once described in the language of cartel warfare, billions in drug proceeds and international extradition, was speaking in the language of separation. Not escape routes, not power, not money, family, contact, distance. It revealed that whatever remained of his life was now measured partly by what he could no longer reach. That detail did not make him sympathetic in the simplistic sense. The crimes tied to his name were too large, too destructive, and too bloody in consequence for that. But it made the reality of his imprisonment more human, and therefore more disturbing. There is something stark about watching a man once associated with vast criminal machinery become consumed by a complaint so painfully ordinary, not being able to speak to his children. It was not the kind of twist people expected from a story about El Chapo, and that was exactly why it mattered. It showed that prison had done what sentencing alone could not. It had reduced the scale of his existence so completely that a missed phone call could become one of the most significant facts known about his life. Beyond the walls, the world kept shifting. Cartel conflicts evolved, alliances fractured, new names emerged, old loyalties turned unstable. The organization he once helped build did not freeze in time simply because he had been locked away. It continued to change without him. That, too, is part of the punishment of a life sentence. It is not only that a man loses the ability to move through the world, it is that the world he once controlled keeps moving without him. Power decays fastest when it can no longer be exercised. Influence fades when it must rely on memory alone. And memory, no matter how feared, is never as strong as physical presence. So the prison story became two stories at once. One was the visible one, a convicted cartel leader serving life in one of the most secure prisons in the United States. The other was quieter and more devastating, a man living long enough to watch the machinery he once commanded continue beyond him, while his own daily existence narrowed further and further into confinement, restriction, and distance. That second story is what made his imprisonment feel less like a dramatic ending and more like a slow erasure. And then another possibility began to take shape, the most dangerous possibility for a man trapped in a place built on isolation. Not escape, not rescue, something more final. The longer he remained buried behind bars, the more one question started to grow in the darkness around his sentence. If El Chapo could no longer control the world outside, what might the world outside decide to do without him?
The final chapter of El Chapo's story in the United States does not unfold with a gunshot, a tunnel, or a midnight convoy slipping through the dark. It unfolds in something much colder than chaos. It unfolds in permanence. After the spectacle of his conviction, after the courtroom sentence that locked his future in place, after the transfer to Colorado, the true ending became brutally simple. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán is serving a life sentence at the federal supermax in Florence, a prison built for inmates considered too dangerous, too high profile, or too difficult to contain anywhere else. That is the reality beneath every rumor, every myth, and every fantasy of one more twist. The dramatic part is already over. What remains is the sentence itself. And that may be the darkest outcome of all. For years, his name was attached to motion. His criminal legacy was built on the idea that barriers could be crossed, that walls could be defeated, that even when captured, he might not stay captured. In Mexico, he escaped prison twice. The second time, in 2015, the escape route itself became part of his legend, a tunnel leading out from beneath the prison, engineered with precision and secrecy, turning confinement into humiliation for the state that had tried to hold him. That history did not just make him infamous, it shaped the rest of his life. It is one of the clearest reasons U.S. authorities treated him as an extraordinary security risk after his conviction, and why the most restrictive prison in the federal system became the place where his sentence would continue. In another kind of story, there would be a final scheme here, a coded message, a hidden ally, a weakness in the architecture, a rumor that the old instincts had returned and that the man who vanished once could vanish again. But the nonfiction version is more severe because it offers no such release. ADX Florence is not known for unpredictability. Its public reputation is built on control. The Bureau of Prisons' own public information makes clear that this is an administrative maximum facility, a place defined by exceptionally tight restrictions, structured movement, and the kind of institutional design meant to reduce risk at every level. In a story like this, the absence of dramatic action is not a gap, it is the point. His life behind bars has been transformed into a world where the system's goal is to prevent the very kind of unpredictability that once made him dangerous. That is why the most revealing public glimpse into his prison life did not come from a breakout attempt or a stunning allegation. It came from a complaint. In 2024, public filings showed Guzmán asking a federal judge to restore or expand his ability to receive phone calls and visits with his family, including his wife and daughters. He said he had not been able to speak regularly with his daughters, and he asked the court to intervene. The answer he got was stark and final. The judge said prison conditions after conviction are the responsibility of the Bureau of Prisons, not the court. In legal language, it was procedural. In human terms, it exposed the scale of his new reality. A man once tied to billions in drug proceeds, international smuggling routes, and a violent transnational cartel was now publicly reduced to pleading for contact with his children. That detail changes the whole picture.
It does not erase what he did. It does not soften the damage linked to the organization he led. It does not transform him into a tragic hero, but it strips away the myth and leaves behind something far more unsettling, the reality of what total confinement does to a life that was once defined by power. The legend of El Chapo was built on scale, large money, large violence, large fear, large reach. Prison has done the opposite. It has compressed everything. His world, as far as the public record shows, is no longer defined by command. It is defined by restrictions. It is defined by what he cannot do, where he cannot go, who he cannot reach, and how little leverage remains once the court case is over and the sentence becomes routine. There is a cruel symmetry in that ending. He spent years outmaneuvering institutions, slipping through systems that were supposed to stop him, surviving where others were captured or killed. He became famous not only because of the cartel he helped lead, but because he seemed able to keep escaping the finality that closes in on most criminal empires. Yet the U.S. prison chapter is nothing but finality. No sudden reversals, no visible expansion of privilege, no sign in the public record that the sentence is becoming lighter with time. Instead, the last known shape of his life is one of the harshest forms of incarceration available in the federal system, under rules and conditions that exist precisely because men like him have proven what they can do when given even the slightest opening. And outside those walls, the world keeps moving without him. That may be the hidden punishment inside a life sentence, not simply being locked away, but remaining alive long enough to become irrelevant to the world you once bent around yourself. Cartels evolve, alliances shift, new names rise, governments change strategies. The machinery of crime does not pause in reverence for the men who once dominated it. It moves on. For a man whose identity was tied so completely to influence and reach, that slow separation may be more devastating than the concrete itself. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is so absolute. The world he once shaped no longer needs his presence to keep changing. This last part is an inference from the public record, but it fits the known facts. His sentence is fixed, his confinement is severe, and his ability to affect even his own daily circumstances appears tightly limited. So the haunting ending is not that El Chapo disappeared again, it is that he didn't. He remains exactly where the system intended him to remain, inside a prison designed for permanence, under a sentence designed to outlast every appeal to power, memory, and legend. The man who once turned escape into global spectacle now lives in a reality where even a request to hear his daughter's voices can be denied without changing the larger course of his punishment. That is what his life behind bars looks like in nonfiction. Not chaos, not cinematic violence, not another tunnel, just the long, deliberate erasure of movement, influence, and myth, one controlled day after another. If you thought this one was dark, there are more real stories where the walls close in slower than anyone expects. Subscribe and stay close to the shadows.